Maloney coming to you from Meanjin in Brisbane. And before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal people in Canberra and pay my respects to all elders, past, present and emerging, and to your elders up in your lands too, Michelle, where you're coming from, and everyone else as well. Michelle is a lawyer who's also an activist, and her work over the last decade or longer has been around earth laws and justice around earth and the rights of nature. And tonight she's going to explore some of those themes and also bring in some of the work that she's been doing with First Nation people around those issues. So thank you, Michelle, and I'll now turn off my camera and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation to join you all. Your course looks amazing, and I hope that it's all been going really well. I think in a moment my slides will be appearing magically thanks to Fred, and as soon as they do, ta-da, I will give my little talk. So yes, Tracy, thank you for your introduction, and I'll introduce myself in a moment. But what I wanted to do first, I'll just see, can you guys see my slides? Yes. Cool. All right. So Tracy invited me to come and share with you a little bit of information, I guess, about the work we do inside the Australian Earth Laws Alliance. So I'll be talking about earth jurisprudence and earth laws, the rights of nature movement globally, what I call the rise and rise of the rights of rivers. I'll talk a little bit, if I have time, about the Citizens' Inquiry into the Barker-Darling River that AELA hosted through the Australian People's Tribunal, because it kind of is a living example of some of the issues that I will have spoken about. And I'll definitely talk about Future Dreaming, an organisation that I co-founded with some wonderful Indigenous colleagues, and the work that we're all doing together. But all of my work, that as I go through the slides, is very much infused with deep respect for Indigenous knowledge and long-term collaboration with Indigenous friends. I was going to say about me, because I actually acknowledge country through my two slides about me. So first of all, this is a beautiful photo of the river out in the middle of Queensland. And I should have put a map. I wasn't aware. I forgot that there were international people involved in this. I grew up out in a little country town called Barcaldine, out in the semi-desert country. And this beautiful waterway here is called the Alice River. And as a kid, I grew up knowing that our river systems were delicate and fragile. Our river was very rarely full like this. This is an unusual photo. For anyone who knows, Australia's river systems, particularly our inland rivers, spend most of their time as just big, old, open, beautiful, sandy riverbeds. And I want to acknowledge the Inangai peoples of the country that I grew up on and still go out and visit and still love. But this is another beautiful watery picture, and this is of the Nudgee waterholes near my home. I live in North Brisbane, or Meanjin, and I would like to acknowledge the Yagara and Turrbal peoples, the original peoples of this continent, of this part of the world, and always like to acknowledge elders past, present and emerging. And as an Australian involved in a lot of social change work, I also like to acknowledge my personal and professional commitment to decolonising the way that we live, work and play on Australian land and the way that we interact with each other. So those beautiful water lilies are where I walk my dog, and really love living here in beautiful Brisbane. But so the talk that I'm going to cover off is really talking a lot about the work that we do within the Australian Earth Laws Alliance. So I'll introduce my organisation very briefly. Oh, sorry, I meant to mention, so in terms of my background, I was lucky enough to go to ANU in Canberra, which is where Tracy is right now, and I studied law, politics, history. And then many years later, after a lot of work around the world with different Indigenous communities here and in the US, based in London for a while, based here and there, I then came back in my late 30s and did a PhD in law, looking at how we could regulate consumption and looking at earth jurisprudence. So in 2012, myself and a couple of other legal colleagues who were all very concerned about the role of law in creating and perpetuating environmental destruction, we created the Australian Earth Laws Alliance. So that was, by the time we incorporated, I think it was early 2012. So yes, next year is our 10th anniversary, which is insane, crazy. But AELA, we're all about trying to shift industrialized societies from a human-centered to a life-centered or earth-centered way of being. And we've been inspired by two core areas of thinking. One is earth jurisprudence, and the other is the remarkable knowledge and governance system of Indigenous peoples of this country here in Australia. And if you're interested in the work we do after the talk I give, if you jump on the website, you'll see how we work. And then we're interested in the sort of the fluid connection of systems change work across law, economics, philosophy, education, ethics, and arts, basically earth-centered everything. And we're involved in work that supports changing culture, reconnecting law and governance to the things that matter, like the human spirit, Indigenous knowledge, Western science. We're very much focused on building the capacity of ordinary people. We're not the kind of group that lobbies government yet. We spend a lot of time supporting communities in their initiatives and creating alternatives and really envisioning a different way of being and governing ourselves so that we're in greater harmony with the living world. Sorry, I'll keep moving around because the little button slips down. So a good starting place is this picture, this big tangled mess. This is the place that I guess you could say the Earth Laws Alliance started with, trying to work out how we had gotten ourselves in such a huge mess in terms of our impacts on the living world. And I'm sure I don't need to tell folks about this remarkable concept that emerged in 2009, planetary boundaries, but we often use it as a way to remind ourselves that the harm that we have caused as particularly industrialized societies, the harm we've caused began as local, regional, and is now extending to a point where we're affecting the entire Earth system. I'll try not to dwell on the negative tonight. But whether you look at the impacts we're having on beautiful planet Earth, or whether you're looking at the social injustices that have been created, particularly through hypercapitalism and these injustices between the rich and the poor, these massive differences between, for example, the 1% and the other 99%, all of these issues are connected to our mode of governance and our mode of being as human beings. So for us, that big tangled mess of concrete, and I can say personally for me, when I came across this concept or this theory of earth jurisprudence, it actually helped me unravel a lot of the mess, and I'll tell you why in a moment. Earth jurisprudence, in a nutshell, is really a philosophy of law and governance. And it's simply based on the idea that humans are just one part of a wider Earth community, and we need to support and protect the interconnectedness of life. And Earth jurisprudence, for someone like me, who was a legal and governance nerd, came along in the right time of my life when I needed to connect with a bigger picture of how we can change the system or the systems of human governance, not just one campaign after the other. So a quick sidestep into definitions. Just a reminder that governance is often made really complicated by Western societies, but it's not. It's just when you get more than 2 or 3 people in a room together, how do you make decisions? How do you work together? So I've put there that, what is governance? They are simply the rules we make to work together, the way we organize ourselves, make decisions, and very importantly, how do we allocate resources and how do we allocate power? And all of these things are underpinned by what we value. And I actually run a lot of different workshops on both governance and other ways of understanding the nuts and bolts of how human beings connect and work together, particularly with a view to opening up, as my mind was opened up, opening up Western minds and ways of doing to other ways, other cultural worldviews and other ways of sharing. So the book that inspired us, and the guy who coined the term earth jurisprudence is Thomas Berry, a deep ecologist or geologian who passed away, unfortunately, in the early years of this century. But he wrote a lot of books about the human spirit and earth-centered spirituality. And towards the end of his career, he pointed his wonderful heart and very, very big brain towards the issues of human governance. So it's this critique that we've actually built a lot of our work on, and which has informed a lot of the work we've done, which I'll tell you about in a moment, with rights of nature and first laws. So in his book, The Great Work, Our Way into the Future, Thomas Berry provides a really excellent critique of what he called the underpinning structures of industrialized society. He looked at the 4 establishments that control human affairs: law and government, economics, universities and education more generally, and religion. And he articulates really well, and it's a beautifully written book. All of his writings are beautiful. They're not sort of clunky and scientific or technical. They're like poetry, but they do explain things. And he points to anthropocentrism, or human-centeredness, and this pro-growth mentality of industrialized societies. And so this analysis of these underpinning systems is very much what AELA has responded to in our own systems change work. I keep going to press the page down button on my own computer. So what I urge people to do, and even if you don't have time to do it now, one day with a cup of tea or a glass of wine, sit down and really contemplate what human-centeredness is all about. Because it often rolls off the tongue of people interested in environmental protection, but it's actually important to think through the impacts and consequences of a truly human-focused worldview. So Thomas Berry said that the deepest cause of the present devastation, the ecological crisis, is found in a mode of consciousness that has established a radical discontinuity between the human and other modes of being. And there are other deep ecologists and scientists who say the very idea that we're separate from nature is like a mental illness. It's like a flawed way of thinking. How can we possibly see ourselves this way? But I've spent many years now analysing and articulating how Western society in particular has been built for thousands of years on a human-centred worldview. And that means that our structures of governance, the way we work together, the decisions we make, the values we reflect are very focused on what's in it for the human. And so the 3 core elements of human-centeredness is that humans are the central fact of the universe, the final aim and end of the universe, and this idea that the earth exists to satisfy human needs and desires. And the reason I urge you to really think about anthropocentrism is that in modern societies, it's very easy to kind of just think, yes, we should care about nature, but to actually make all of our decisions with a view to ensuring that the living world continues, whether it's rivers and oceans, whether it's trees and forests, it really, really does put constraints on the material and pro-growth way that we live right now. And it really challenges us to value different things. So it's an important exercise and something worth pursuing. Even if you feel that you already understand it, it really is good to contemplate what would it look like if everything we ever did incorporated the health of the living world, not just people. Okay, so that's just a basic introduction to the idea that Earth jurisprudence is all about us examining the root causes of the current ecological crisis and inviting us to shift our worldview and our rules and laws from this idea on the left, the triangle that puts the human being, and if you look carefully, it's a man, at the top of the system, that everything's hierarchical and other things and lesser beings and smaller creatures in particular are much less than us. And the earth-centered worldview puts us back into the web of life and says that really fundamentally at a biological level or a molecular level, we are no different to any other organism on this planet. We're all interdependent and we all need each other to survive. So why don't we start acting that way? So the other thing that Earth jurisprudence does is it does do a specific challenge to the legal system. And I just wanted to show you a couple of examples of how the current Western legal system is very different to Earth jurisprudence or an Earth-centered way of thinking. And then at the end of my talk, I want to show you, after introducing some of the first laws and Indigenous work that I'm connected to, I'm non-Indigenous, so I don't say I'm involved in, but connected to. I will add a third column to this table and show you how very similar and how inspired Earth jurisprudence is to Indigenous first laws. So just quickly, if we look to the left, the current Western legal system sees human laws as the highest authority. Since the Enlightenment and the secular society emerged in the West, we don't defer to God, but nor do we defer to the laws of nature. And very importantly, it's why it's in red, in Western law, nature is just a commodity. It's just property. And we'll talk about this a lot more in the rights of nature section of my talk. And again, in Western law, there are legal rights for humans and corporations and even ships, but not for the natural world. And the laws of our system are very much built on perpetuating a growth ideology. And I give a whole nother talk about our history as Europeans. I say our because that's my area of culture. The colonization that started in the 1600s basically brought a whole range of sort of pro-expansionist, extractivist and different ways of being to all the other parts of the world. I won't go into all the other bits, but in contrast, Earth jurisprudence, the work that Thomas Berry and many other deep ecologists connect with, this idea that the laws of the natural world, everything from gravity to oxygen and many other things, are actually the primary laws, and human beings should fit within those laws. The idea that nature is not just for human use, but there is in fact an entire Earth community bubbling along, doing its thing, intrinsic value, some people call it, or just, the autonomous beings that are all out there in the world, separate from humans. And then, of course, Earth jurisprudence also advocates for the rights of nature to be acknowledged and enshrined in law. And there's a whole bunch of other really interesting concepts connected into these theories, but we don't have time today. So what I like to explain to people, and I think my next slide actually says this, is that what's really cool is that since 1999, when Thomas Berry wrote that book, in Western law, one of the fastest growing movements is in fact rights of nature and earth laws. And I started my law degree right back in 1988. And nothing hugely exciting happened until the 21st century in environmental law terms, because the paradigm shifting notions inside earth-centeredness started to emerge through earth jurisprudence, rights of nature, legal personhood for nature, law of ecocide, which admittedly had been lurking around in the system since the early 20th century, but came to much more prominence in this century. And now an emerging area, ecological law and governance. So this earth laws is what AELA, at least, uses as this umbrella term for life-centered governance. And as I said before, governance is all about all the rules we work together with. It's not just law, it's everything. It's really important. And you can create quite profound systems change by tweaking core elements of governance. And on this side of the umbrella, separate to earth jurisprudence, but absolutely, I guess, more ancient and absolutely a core inspiration for earth jurisprudence are these notions of Indigenous first laws. Aboriginal peoples of this continent, the many hundreds and hundreds of first peoples in their really old, ancient governance systems across this continent, knew that the law was in the land, and that from that template, the relationship between people and the land forged a template for the relationships between people. And that's what Mary Graham, an Indigenous elder and philosopher, refers to as the relationist ethos and the law of obligation. And then there's these really interesting concepts popping up, which I won't have much time to talk about, I'm sorry, but out of the rights of nature stuff that's been emerging in the Western legal system, sort of the Western law pushing back at itself, inspired by many of these first laws ideas, but kind of unique to the West as well. Then Aboriginal people have been picking up, like Anne Paulina and the Kimberley, and saying, well, rights of nature is an interesting concept, but what about the rights of ancestral beings? How can we recognize those beings to still be existing today? Again, that's a really cool and interesting area. I won't go through that. I think I've just said it all. But yeah, in AELA, we use the term earth laws to cover earth jurisprudence, ecological law, ecocide, and all the other legal concepts and approaches that are being created within and directly challenge existing Western traditions of law. And it really is an exciting area because, in fact, I think the next slide, no, there's another slide. I'll talk about why it's exciting. So Tracy, I do hope you're keeping an eye on my time. I'm trying to cover a lot of issues and I hope I don't go too far over, but I think I've got another 20 minutes maybe. So what are rights of nature laws? Very simply put, They are laws that aim to change the legal status of nature. So there's a whole range of other ways that rights of nature can be explained through social movements. But in terms of law, it really is all about changing the legal status of nature from being just human property to being recognised as a rights-bearing entity of its own. And I'll come back to that again in a moment. The big question is, why have rights of nature laws emerged? Why has it become this really fascinating place of law and place of social movements in the last 10 years in particular? The accelerating ecological crisis is seeing activists, lawyers, members of the judiciary, Indigenous people trying to push back at the rolling destruction of industrialization in any way that they can find. And so rights of nature laws have been seen as one of those ways. And this is what I was going to say, you know, one of the questions people will often ask is, well, how is it any different to environmental law? Surely environmental laws are just as important, and they absolutely are. Earth laws advocates would say that modern Western environmental law, which really only emerged in the 1970s, has achieved a great deal of good stuff with all the initial command and control type, you know, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act in the US, and that mode of thinking about environmental protection in different silos and heavily regulated by government started to roll across the rest of the world. But in terms of the systems we live within, environmental law, first and foremost, permits harm. It literally regulates the extent to which you can pollute or the extent to which you can log, clear, mine, etc. It doesn't directly challenge the pro-growth or private property mode of economic and social organising of capitalism and hyper-capitalism. And what a lot of people forget is that in the 1970s, the environmental laws that emerged were really being tacked onto private property laws that had been around for at least 500 years. And in some places like Britain, much, much longer than that. So we really have got this way of being, this way of thinking from English law in Australia particularly, that still is profoundly caught up in a human-centred way of being and using up property and resources in an expansionist, extractivist way. The other thing that a lot of people very rarely question about law is this idea in the West and industrialized countries. Law is seen as something that comes from government. And I'll repeat that. The law in our system is seen as coming from government. In Indigenous communities, the law coming from the land, or the laws from the land and the people itself, was a self-created, reinforcing system of norms and rules. And there was no higher authority other than the people themselves respecting what had gone before them and the laws that helped sustain their communities. So this state-centric notion of top-down law, typically enforced by military and other state violence, if it has to, is a really particular way of seeing the law. So just to remind us then, at present, nature is invisible in the eyes of Western law. It is property, it's an object, bits of it might be protected, like a national park or a protected area. But I often run people, particularly when I talk to school groups, to tell them to pretend you're putting the lenses of the law across your eyes. You're putting glasses on and you see what the legal system sees. The entire living world disappears and you see people, lots of people. And you see big boxy things with brand names on them, and you'll see corporations. And that's because in Western law, it's a social construct. Our legal system is made up by us. We make the rules, we try to enforce them upon each other. And in our legal system, since at least the 1600s, but actually earlier than that through constructs in the church, the Christian church, corporations are seen by the Western legal system as a legal entity. We created them. So people, corporations, and ships, which I actually don't know much about, but they're all incorporated entities. So they have the right to go to court, sue, defend their rights, and own things. And these are typical human right and and corporate rights. So unless rights of nature or other imaginaries in the legal system are created, then nature is not even seen as alive. And that's a really important point, I think, the fact that our system does not see the living world. It's a sad, sad thing. So this is the fun stuff. Where have rights of nature laws emerged? When we formed up AELA we started a conference in 2011, it was formed in 2012. At that stage, rights of nature existed in the Constitution of Ecuador, in a national law in Bolivia, and in 2011 there'd been one rights of nature case, the Vilcabamba River case in Ecuador. So now have a look at what's going on around the world. This isn't even all of them. So you can see how this idea of rights of nature laws started to become quite prolific and quite busy. And I'm not going to talk to all of this, but there's a couple of things I'll talk about in a moment. Ecuador was the first sort of Western style legal system, even though you wouldn't classify Ecuador as the West, but it's got a Western constitution. And that's where a lot of people thought rights of nature laws started. But in fact, they started in the USA with a lot of local laws created by a couple of really remarkable lawyers, Thomas Lindsay and Mari Margul, who have since become colleagues and friends. But so Indigenous elders in Ecuador invited them to come in and help them craft the rights of nature law in Ecuador. And not a lot happened between the sort of 2011 Vilcabamba River case. You'll see there's this gap here. And then in 2017, a lot of people know about the Whanganui River, the Urewera Forest, Mount Taranaki. These are ecosystems in New Zealand that were recognised as having their own legal personhood rights. And I'll talk about the differences between all this. Since then, it really has been a lot of waterways, rivers, and even glaciers in India, ecosystems in Colombia, which started with the Atrato River, and then lots of other places. The Magpie River, one of the most recent ones in Canada. So the rise of the rights of nature, as I think a really strong effort by lawyers and environmentalists and Indigenous folks to try to protect the living world and help it stand up for itself in the eyes of the law. So a couple of key points to think about with rights of nature. And if you're interested in this, AELA does occasionally run webinars and other info, so connect with us. If not, I'm going to keep it pretty simple because not everyone's fascinated by this. But when you're thinking about the rights of nature, there's a couple of key questions. Firstly, what are rights? And there's some standard definitions. I'm going to give you one in a minute. But you always have to go into the detail because there's lots of different ways of doing this. So you ask, who or what has rights? We've just talked about humans and corporations and ships having certain rights. What rights does it have? Who can enforce them? And what impact does the law have in practice? So I want to mention rights in a bit more detail, just this one slide, because in a moment I'm going to talk about Indigenous first laws, which weren't built on rights, but they were built on obligations. So a very simple definition of what rights are is that they are legal, social, or ethical principles of freedom or entitlement. They are basically rules about what is allowed of people or what is owed to people. And it's really interesting because I kept that dot point in from when I was writing this up. Rights are seen as being essentially important in disciplines such as law and ethics. However, that thing comes with a proviso. Rights are seen as critically important to Western law, not so much in a lot of other cultures and a lot of other legal systems. And that's where rights of nature gets interesting. I won't talk too much to this, but I'll move through it quickly. I've already touched on this idea that we've started in Ecuador with the Constitution. Bolivia had national laws. New Zealand changed. So I took this tree as a simple image. I should have, in hindsight, changed this for you and made it a waterway, a river branching off into tributaries. But if at the core, rights of nature is all about changing the legal status of nature in Western law, so that's our big trunk down here, what we saw rights of nature across an entire jurisdiction in local councils in the US, across the country in Ecuador and Bolivia. But then we saw some interesting developments. We saw legal personhood rights recognised for rivers, a river in New Zealand. And legal personhood rights are a little narrower than pure rights of nature laws. But then we saw in Colombia, again, not across a country, not across a whole jurisdiction, but an ecosystem, rivers, and later an entire bioregion of the Amazon. It had its own area of rights. And if you can see that, it hasn't happened yet, but we see people like Anne Polina from the Kimberley writing papers and talking about rights of ancestral beings. And then the other, I think there's one last little sort of category or sub-branch in North America. The Ojibwe band of Indigenous folks have recognized the right of their wild rice to exist. And it's their way of defending this particular plant from corporatization. So there's a lot of different ways now that all of these things are emerging. I think I might skip this. I don't know if I have time. I'd really like to talk a bit more about future dreaming, but if anyone's interested, I can share the slides. In a nutshell, this hardcore view of rights of nature, particularly stemming from Thomas Berry's work, has a particular theory of life behind it, and it is that all of life has its own right to exist. Bees have bee rights, rivers have river rights. You don't give a river human or legal personhood rights, you give it river rights. And this stuff really matters in practice, because you're not just giving it the right to own property and sue and be sued. You're saying this river has a right to flow and not flow, to support life, etc. In contrast, these ideas of legal personhood versus a subject of rights, they kind of come with different legal descriptions and ways of working. So if anyone who's listening to this is ever interested in doing their own activism or their own law reform, it's really worth understanding a little bit of these differences. But again, I won't go into them tonight. So when we come to Australia, which people like myself would call still a colonial country, a place where the British invaded in 1788, they took over, there were no treaties. We're one of the only countries in the world that has 0 treaties between the original colonial powers and the original peoples, the first peoples. So what does all of this mean in a place like Australia, where there were hundreds, and are still today, of Aboriginal First Nations, or Mary Graham refers to them as a continent covered in very equal, autonomous, like a local council boundary place. So rights of nature and earth laws are emerging, well, they're being discussed and popping up in different ways in a continent that already has a pre-existing legal system. So it makes it even more interesting to see what's possible in terms of pushing back at the worst of industrialization. So the big issue with rights is that, particularly in the early days, it did receive a lot of flack, a lot of criticisms from lawyers about how would you do this, a lot of criticism from people who thought it was ridiculous, and also people who just don't like rights-based approaches to law. So some would say rights-based laws are not compatible with Indigenous worldviews. Other Indigenous people disagree, and they've used rights of nature approaches, as I just said, even for the rights of wild rice. How do you speak for nature anyway? That conversation is kind of less valid these days, because most people just point out, well, Coca-Cola has people who can speak for it, and it's not even real. It's just a bunch of people selling a product. But because it has legal personhood rights, people can speak for Coca-Cola and every other corporation in a court of law. If you're unfortunate enough to be harmed in an accident and not able to defend yourself or speak for your own rights, someone will speak for you as a guardian. There are already well-established ways in Western law to speak for others, speak for the voiceless, and speak for nature. As to the difference rights of nature laws can make, in a lot of places, as you would have seen in that little list, some of these laws are very new, and we haven't even had cases in some of those jurisdictions. But in Ecuador, there have been several dozen rights of nature cases, many of which have been found in favour of nature. And I would suggest it is making a difference. It's not going to make the difference. But in Australia, we have to recognise the legacy of colonialism, and we have to be very careful not to try to throw rights of nature laws over the top of Indigenous first laws, because that could just be another form of Western colonisation. So I'm sure in your discussions, I know that you've had some amazing Indigenous speakers. But when you look across the continent of Australia, and this map is not perfect, but it really shows the remarkable interconnected communities that governed this country and in many places continue to govern country, then all of those individual places had their own laws, remarkable pluriverse, people up here with rainforest laws, people out here with desert laws, and the folks, all of these folks with sea country having their sea laws and their governing systems that helped them care for country and, I guess, honour their obligation to care for their lands and their people. I'm not sure if time permits. There are different perspectives on different Indigenous perspectives about things like rights of nature and the emergence of Western earth laws. People like Virginia Marshall, she wrote a remarkable book called Aqua Nullius. She argues that first and foremost in Australia, we have to have the return, or not so much the laws have always been in place for Aboriginal people. We have to make primary Indigenous laws, water law, and other cultural legal systems have to come back to the fore. Irene Watson, a remarkable lawyer and Indigenous woman in South Australia, would say the same. Mary Graham is doing a lot of work on articulating this relationist ethos and law of obligation that I really want to make sure I have time to share with you. And Paulina, remarkable elder, I don't think she'd call herself an elder, but she is a remarkable leader from the Kimberley. The Wunan law, the regional laws and the local laws that are absolutely still in place and strong were never based on rights. They were based on obligation to care for country. But Anne can see the discourse and the usefulness of throwing these ideas back at the West to make them think. And that's why she's been looking at the rights of ancestral beings to exist, in particular the rights of the Martuwarra or Fitzroy River. And there's a huge amount of work been going on for years in the Kimberley because so many big mining companies and others are looking with greedy eyes at the absolutely spectacularly beautiful Martuwarra River. But as all the Indigenous mobs up there say, all the water in that river is allocated to the people and to all the life forms that depend on it, including some truly remarkable fish. So in Australia, though, when it comes to our Western law, we are dealing with some of the harshest and most violent legal systems or legal ideas that the Western world has ever produced. And some of this is worth pushing back at with other Western constructs whilst we bridge and change Western law in this country. So I won't go into this too much, but it shows and reminds us how the British claimed and in many places destroyed parts of this continent until it claimed all of it. And these aspects of our life, and again, I run some very specific workshops on understanding the governance and legal system that we live within so that people can understand more how to more effectively challenge institutional structures that are so embedded, they're like etched into the bones of non-Indigenous people. But the deep structural injustices that come with this Western way of thinking, the hierarchical structure. In 1788, when the Brits came to Australia, and today even, kings and queens were literally the voice of God. All the power was controlled by elites. And the state then and now was supported by the military, by force. Patriarchal laws and culture came to this continent in 1788 and were only broken down in the first part of the 20th century, but they're still in place. As a woman, I can vouch for this. And things that people like Professor Yin Paradis, who's a race relations professor at Deakin, if you ever get a chance to listen to his talks, tap in, because he talks about these ideas of modernity and progress and all of these concepts that built the mindset of Western folks and European folks in resource extraction, expansionism. You know, every time you run out of resources, you go to another country and grab theirs, and cultural superiority, and of course the power of corporations. All of these ideas were fully formed and came to this continent. And many of us, although born from non-Indigenous communities, fifth generation Aussie, I think, from the Irish side, we're appalled by a lot of these structures and are trying to actively transform them into something better, something more compassionate and something earth-centered. So if rights of nature is a bridging concept to something better, I'm 100% for it. If Indigenous people grab rights of nature and turn it into something that supports first laws, I'm for it. What we don't do in AELA is that we're not evangelists. We don't turn up and go, thou shalt do it this way. We just say, hey, what can we do to respect the living world, go way beyond these very narrow environmental laws and build something better. I think Erin O'Donnell and others have already talked to you about the Yarra River Act. This is a really important development in Australia. It's not technically a rights of nature law because the Crown still thinks it owns the land. Wow. But it really is the first law in Australia to recognise the entire river as a living being, which is awesome, and really deep connection and recognition with the First Peoples and the creation of the Birrarung Council. So it's an excellent move forward. I did just want to mention the Blue Mountains Council. Long story short, for a couple of years, community members were asking us, and we popped into the community, gave workshops and talked to really vocal advocates, and they themselves were very passionate about getting the rights of nature into discourse in the Blue Mountains. And the Blue Mountains City Council is one of the most progressive in Australia. And in April this year, we had done a bit more work chatting to their staff last year. We wrote some briefing papers, but they themselves were really, really passionate about this. So they became the first council to adopt rights of nature as a foundational principle. So it's not a law, but it's actually something more powerful because it is going to open up some really important changes in the way that the council itself connects with ecocentric ideas, but also will open up some very deliberate community processes to discuss what first laws, what Aboriginal people want, and what ecocentrism or rights of nature might look like in their place. And that's really how to have these conversations. It's got to be unique to the place. I just wanted to mention, I've already touched on it, but if you're interested in Indigenous wisdom, do try to Google Mary Graham's work. I'm working on a book with her at the moment, which I hope we'll have out early next week. God, I wish, early next year. That will bring a lot of her work together, but she is seriously one of the most amazing thinkers in the world, definitely in Australia, and is helping to articulate the kind of the core philosophy of the civilization that really, when you go deeply into their governance system, is just mind-blowingly awesome. So Mary Graham, if you look on YouTube and you Google articles, do try to catch, particularly in the last couple of years when she's been talking a lot about the relationist ethos, the law of obligation. And in a minute, I'll mention future dreaming. We run workshops together. So about a year and a half ago, Mary, myself, another wonderful Indigenous elder, Ross Williams, and another colleague, Lib, and now James, set up Future Dreaming to share ecological knowledge. Our little tagline there is sharing knowledge to build a better future for all of us. And it's a really special little organisation. At the moment, because we started just before COVID hit, we haven't done a lot of the on-ground projects that we're hoping to get moving with some funding support, probably next year, hopefully. But in the meantime, we run workshops and discussions, and we bring people together in a really safe space to talk about important issues. Mary's ideas around the relationist ethos and her articulation of one of the oldest governance systems in the world is really worth connecting with. That's just a little snip of the relationist ethos and some of these core elements. It's just beautiful. So I think this and maybe one other slide is probably all I'll finish off on. Doing well for time. So you'll remember, if you kind of just block this out for 1 second, you'll remember I had gone through what an earth-centered or earth jurisprudence says about the world and the earth community versus Western law. In longer workshops, we talk about this in more detail, but when you refer to Aboriginal law, and across all the First Peoples, regardless of the fact that they all had their own unique way of seeing and their own unique laws, they all had this, what Mary calls a pan-Aboriginal philosophy. The land is the source of the law. They are first laws. The first laws are what the people are obliged to do to care for country. There's all these other beautiful laws, law of obligation, custodial responsibility, reciprocity and balance, deep time, circular time. And what we found interesting is when I put these together, even Mary was sort of shocked at how raw and blatant this is. So Aboriginal communities believe the land is the source of the law. I mean, it is the template. Earth jurisprudence talks about this idea of a great law. The laws of the natural world are higher than human laws. Western law literally has no first laws. Let that sink in for a moment. Like, we literally have no positive obligation or ethical rule to care for the land. Our obligations are to use up the land, definitely use it wisely if we can, so we can get as much out of it as we can. But the fact that, the Europeans used up stuff and then went off to other people's place and stole it shows that there were no deep first laws, or so many things are not in our legal system that could be. And some of these things that can be rectified, I believe, absolutely will be in the next few years and the next few decades. So the only other thing I wanted to mention, I've got two of them there. Cool. I'll talk about this one first. If you've not heard, and you probably haven't, if you haven't heard of Regenerative Songlines Australia, again, I won't go into the detail tonight, but please do have a little look on this website, regenerative-songlines.net.au. In particular, under events, there's the first event was a launch in July, and about 3 or 4 hours have been recorded, and it includes talks by Anne Polina, Mary Graham, Tyson Yonka-Porter, many other Indigenous elders. Mary and I give a talk together about the work we're doing, exploring all these ideas. It's really worth watching. It's pretty fantastic. And the network itself, the way it's emerged, it's turning into a really powerful place for Indigenous folks to come together and lead conversations, discussions, knowledge sharing around regenerating land and caring for country. The only other thing I did want to mention is this Green Prince program, which I basically have been designing and refining for the last 5 years, which is connecting with lots of other communities now. We've only just started to roll it out officially in the last couple of months. The website is up, but there's a lot of pages with not much on it, but you will see the steps of the Green Prince approach. This is quite literally a reflection of 30 years of work across sustainability, new economy, natural resource management, or everything, all brought into some manageable steps, particularly for community groups, but we've actually got local councils now and schools connecting with Green Prince. So I just wanted to mention that it's the space that brings all of the work that we all need to do together into a manageable kind of way of understanding and doing something with it. I think on that note, I am finished, and I thank you for your patience. It's a little weird to talk into a computer screen and not see you all or know if you're there, but I'm trusting you're there and I haven't put you to sleep. And if you are interested in any of our work, our websites are there. So, yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Michelle. That was really fantastic. And we'll swap over so you'll see all the beautiful faces. I have one more question. I just have one question before we open to the floor. I was sitting there thinking about, the laws that we have in Australia at the moment, and the Environmental Bioconservation, the EPBC Act, the Biodiversity.
Yeah,
the biodiversity conservation and the weakening of that, in recently, how can we, on that note of people powered changing the laws, what can we do? It's something that personally concerns me. Because,
I would not normally say this because I'm not a kind of an arrogant person who points everyone to me, but we have been listening to this question. So AELA's 10 years old, but that's been built on top of 20 years of working with Indigenous mates and other law. And so in combination with developing Green Prince, we're also building this thing called the Australian Network for Ecocentric Communities, ANEC, because what we're hearing is more and more communities want to be involved in transforming legal problems. And I have to tell you, if you connect in with the work we're doing, we are not saying let's change this section or that section of the EPBC Act. We're saying actually we need a significant transformation to have local bioregional laws unique for place, kind of at a scale level. So we need to transform who has power over decision making at the local level. We need to embed all local laws to reflect healthy benchmarks for place. All of these things don't exist in our legal system. It's quite remarkable. So we're arguing for sort of bioregional up or catchment up legal structures. And what we want to do over the next couple of years is build a movement of groups from anywhere in Australia who want to argue for the same thing, so that we can get a groundswell of people saying, you know what, tweaking these flawed state laws, flawed federal laws, it's not enough. And I'm sure people listening now understand also that we can't just change the existing environmental laws. Some of them are good, but the big problem also is that even with environmental laws in place, our system has always privileged corporate power, because the Crown, the government in Australia, can use oil and petroleum exploration and mining laws to override everything. So it's not enough anymore to even argue to tweak the EPBC Act, poor thing. The whole Western legal system needs to be turned on its head. And instead of saying, we're going to activate this ability to maybe stop a development when this poor endangered animal pops up, it's like, no, we want to have laws that say, thou shalt care for this bioregion, thou shalt transform its economic mode of being and thinking, and you will transform our culture so that we can be more like the stuff that existed before 1788. And on the one hand, it seems mad and crazy and, you'll never get it done in Australia. But the flip side to that, I often remind people, the idea that we can have endless growth is far more ridiculous than the idea that we could transform the system so that we can care for place. And given the work I do across new economy and land management groups, there's already a phenomenon of terrific people doing amazing work. We just need to tweak a few things. So that was a very long answer to your question, but it's very complex. And AELA, some groups work inside the system. AELA's going, you know what, the system's broken. Our part is to show what could happen if we did other things, and we'll see what emerges. So.
That's a really good, what I was hoping you'd respond with something like that, because my sister, she's an environmental scientist, and she used to work in the wildlife approval area, which used to administer the Act years ago, and she used to call it death of 1,000 cuts.
Yep.
That you could work your way, even with if there's a legal act that protects something, developers find a way to hack around the corner. They'll find a way to pick it, and before you know it, the ecosystem.
Well, in fact, it's very relevant, because when I mentioned Thomas Lindsay and Mari Margle, who really started the rights of nature movement as we know it, and they started like an existing public environmental law firm. They would come in, a community would say, this company is going to take all our water, or this company is about to dump toxic sludge on our ag lands. How can we stop them? And they'd say, well, you can't. The law's not designed for you to stop them. But what we can do is challenge one aspect of their environmental impact assessment, or challenge this. And what they said was they would put all that time into challenging the thing, and then the corporations would basically look across it and go, oh, thank you. Now we know which bits to fix up when we relodge everything. And, that's what happened. They realized that they had to step outside the system, because, as they said, environmental law is really just designed to control environmentalists. So, yeah. And look, I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not naive, but we figure there's a few of us who have the wherewithal to try to reimagine the system, then that's probably our job. And others need to fight inside the system for what we have. And we're all the same big, journey. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd like to open it to the floor. I'm sure that other people have questions for Michelle. I thought you'd see everybody. What happened?
Talk them into a trance.
They're mesmerised.
I often do that to people.
I don't know what. I thought we had everybody on the...
Yeah, I saw them for a minute.
Oh, yeah.
Hey, I just put a question in the chat box. Sorry, it's a bit dark. But you were mentioning before that governance is sort of underpinned by societal norms, values. I think you called it culture. I did my PhD on governance as well, so I'm very intrigued by this idea of you want to change the governance systems, you want to change laws, but how do we start with changing culture? How do we start by changing the mindsets in society at large? So laws.
It depends where you are. Can I ask where you are?
Yeah. I'm in Australia.
Oh, you are? Okay. So culture is unique to place wherever you are. And there's no general answer to a question that general. I would ask questions back. Whose culture do you want to change and why? Where are they? Where do they live? How do you reach them? You might want to be working with local farmers who are trashing the joint with certain practices. Then you need to be thinking pedagogically about how you connect with people where they are and what they know. You might want to run a massive media campaign for an entire continent. How you change culture is complex and differs from example to example. You know, the quickest way we can change the culture in Australia is actually with government leadership. I know, it's a shocking concept. The idea that once upon a time had governments who would lead with strong values and ethics, So we're left with each other. The work we do focuses on civil society. There's all manner of theories about changing culture. There's everything from the S-curve to certain percentage of your population. If they could understand a certain thing, then they'll take people. But changing culture is part of it. But there's also whether you think like a neoliberal idea of if we just change everyone's mind and every single person does things differently, or whether we're structuralists and we say, instead of asking those 30 people to not litter, or if we're, let's try to create structures that don't produce that plastic waste in the first place. So there's lots of different ways to pick apart governance. For us, our simple idea has been to work with, some people call them early adopters. Other people call them the 20% of people who are already active. You can't roll in with Earth Laws stuff into a group like, a rabid mining company. They very rarely get Earth Laws. They're not ready for that. They might be ready for ecosystem services or the commodification, carbon pricing. So with Earth Laws, we've been very particular about the groups. In a way, we actually only work with people who invite us in because we're not evangelists and we don't pretend to know everything that has to happen. But community-based catalysts and leading people like councils and others who want to do stuff, then we can come in and support them, encourage them, give them materials, give them advice. That's how we do it, but everyone's different. So I don't know if that helps a bit. There is no silver bullet to any of the problems we're facing. There's no one answer.
I think it sounds like a good idea going where sort of the current is. Now we're talking about water, going with where the momentum is. I guess I'm slightly pessimistic and thinking that we're not going to change the culture or whatever, then the perspective of leadership before the broader society sort of pushing for it. The same has happened with marriage equality and things like that. There really needs to be clear evidence that the bigger population is ready for such significant change, for example, to laws before the government is going to do it.
Some laws, sure. But just remember local councils like the BMCC, like other local councils we're actually working with. The one thing I would say is that I've been privileged enough to work with thousands and thousands of people across this country, from people developing social enterprises, fair food systems, social justice, human rights, Indigenous groups, land care, water care, catchment care. It's astonishing how many awesome people are already out there. And if we get everyone pointed in a slightly new direction, some of this change is absolutely inevitable. And it's already the last 10 years, what I've seen with support for Indigenous groups and the rise and rise of Indigenous people owning, getting land back. Don't forget that. This is something that a lot of Westerners forget. Like I've just come back from Coranda and Cairns, and so much land has been handed back to the people who do want to care for it, and that's really encouraging. So, but I hear you. Getting governments to do anything, they follow. They don't lead. At the moment, they follow. So that's our world. That's what we work with.
There's a great program called Message Stick, which highlights a twist in communication, and rather saying the poor us, help us type of communication, saying we're here and we're proud and we're strong, and changing the twist on the message that you're sending can send a lot of different communications, and it's twisting culture because you're sending it from just a different angle, and
Absolutely.
it's proven to just change a different way of changing culture rather than hearing the same message in a underdog type of way. But
there's so many things that can be done, and Australians have always typically looked to the government. And AELA, our creation, was at a time when we were incorporated in 2012 when Tony Abbott rolled in and axed the Climate Commission, and it reformed through civil society support. Tried to cut funding to EDOs. I was the chairperson of an EDO at the time, and people just continue to rise and create. And that's it. That's even the new economy stuff. It's changed the narrative. Don't wait for others to give you permission. Just keep trying to do the next good thing and change the rules and try to change the political system. I mean, our politics are the nastiest spot in Australia because that's where the old white men are. And, tough.
Michelle, there's a couple of questions in the chat. One from Barnamala.
Oh, I'm sorry. I don't even know what the chat is. Hang on.
It's a button on your left side, and it's blue. It's the second. It's the first from the top. But I can read them.
Yep, I've got it. What do we got?
So one from Barnamala saying, how do we involve, or who are we to involve even, Indigenous communities in policy making? A question I have been thinking of for some years now.
I can't see the question. Oh.
You might need to scroll up from Barnamala.
Okay, thank you. I think it kind of depends on what it is you'd like to do, because most Aboriginal communities have their own leaders involved in their own policy work and their own community development work. If you're doing things you'd like to involve them with, then you just need to reach out and see if it's of interest and importance to them. I don't think, how should I say this? It's very important, and I'm sure you know this, to not think of Aboriginal people as needing our help so much as needing solidarity. If you've got your own initiatives, you need to do the hard yards of forming relationships and seeing if your issues are at all relevant to these people. The best way to forge solidarity is to reach out to anyone where they are, and work together and walk together and build things together, because colonialism is riddled with good intentions and people who think they know what other people need. And the best antidote to that is to just try to build relationships and have a yarn. I don't know if that answers the question, but it really depends on who you are and who you're working with and what it is you want to achieve. Hang on, I've got
one from Jude.
Oh, is that before the one from Tanya? Okay. Bioregional law, benchmarks, careful place. Yes. I can't see the question. What is your
response? Yep, sorry. What is your response to Environment Minister Suzanne Ley is appealing a federal court by declaration she has a duty of care to protect children from future personal injury?
Oh, great question. I've been following that Sharma case. That's a ripper. I think it's not only horrific and rude, it's insane. What kind of system do we have if a bloody minister of the Australian government, which is elected by the people, is arguing that they don't have a duty of care to young people? It's insanity. The good thing is this case is going to tear its way up to the High Court, and the High Court has just come down with it's been a long day, I can't remember. The High Court should come back and argue that the government does have this duty of care. And just interestingly, so for those who perhaps, if they don't know, the case that Jude's referring to is the Sharma case, where a bunch of young'uns with a guardian took the federal environment minister to court, arguing that they shouldn't allow the expansion of a particular coal mine, And in fact, the minister should be applying her powers under the relevant act with reference to a duty of care, to care for young people. And insanely, the day the decision came down, the government announced it would challenge that decision. Now, the only good thing is, about a month ago, I can't remember, there was a different case in New South Wales where bushfire survivors challenged the EPA, the Environment Protection Agency, and said that they needed to take into account climate change in their own policies and that they had a moral right, duty to look after people. And they did not challenge the case. They stood there and said, we're not going to challenge the case. We're actually going to listen and incorporate this advice into our work. So it's not lost. We've just got the federal government are just pathological. So, yes, I'm incensed by that decision.
Thanks, Michelle. There's another question.
From Simone?
Yeah.
I've got one from Simone, but they keep popping past me. Simone says, what challenges have you and community members faced when trying to change the laws? Number one, the biggest barrier is most people really don't believe we can change the laws. You'd think it was gravity or oxygen. It's really interesting to me. But look, it's true. The legal system in Australia is both stable and entrenched and conservative and hard to shift. So challenges are believing that change is possible. Other challenges are people not really having the courage to step out and do something a bit different. People are really in this country often locked into a kind of campaign mode. We must fight the government. We must challenge the government on its policies as opposed to building something new in the shell of the old. So I think we have to do all of those things. So I think there are tons of challenges. And look, I'll be honest, I have not myself responsible for changing any laws yet. And I'm not sure the kinds of change I want to see happen. I'm not even sure I'm going to see it in my lifetime, because what we're talking about is a profound shift. But we have done the research to show that you can tweak certain elements of local council laws and state policy laws. And I do believe, in a matter of years, some of the decision-making is going to shift because of all the other pressures. I don't know if you noticed, but a week or two ago, or was it just the other day, a whole bunch of activists stacked the shareholder meeting for, I can't remember the company. And they actually even though the board of directors advised against certain actions, the shareholders voted for this company, this fossil fuel company, to ensure that it has climate targets embedded in its strategies. Now, there's some funky change happening all over the place. So as all of these forces shift, the clunkier laws from government will shift. These old people making these decisions are not going to stay there forever. So, but yeah, lots of challenges: bravery, courage, being able to sustain yourself in the face of no money. I've been doing this for 9 years and just scrounging money here and there from teaching and workshops. And first time I ever got any funding from a weird philanthropist who found me this year it started a month ago. And now I can afford to go to the dentist. I may even fix my car. These are exciting days. So it's all hard, but that's okay. There's no other game in town. I mean, life is all there is. Fiona says, last century, the Oz suffragettes achieved a model for global suffrage. What can we learn from this culture change model? You have literally got to put yourself on the line. Great question. The suffragettes were remarkable. I mean, men didn't just hand over the vote or power or equality. They had to fight their asses off for it. And I think, I do believe that the change people are arguing for now will happen. I'm just not sure what state of planet we'll have by the time we get our house in order. But yeah, what can we learn? Direct action, be radical, be brave, have some kind of specific outcome you want, because, even Extinction Rebellion, which I love, sometimes as someone like me, I kind of think, I get that you've got this sort of strategy, tell the truth, act on climate, but sometimes it does still feel a little bit vague. Anyway, it's all good. Jude says it gives her hope. Oh, good, I'm glad. I do have a lot of hope. I do. What do we got here? This even filters down into housing and how homes will be built in the future. Absolutely. Absolutely. One thing I didn't talk about, because there's just so much going on and I didn't want to fry your brains with my endless monologue. But in the first 2 years of AELA, the very first thing we did, because we are humble, we're enthusiastic, but we're humble, and we thought there's already tons of people out there doing good stuff. Let's do a roadshow. Let's host a few talks about earth laws and how much we love earth jurisprudence and see who, we shake the tree and see who comes out. And tons of cool people did. But what we found is every single conversation was always bumping up against the economy. So another area of great outcomes over the last few years, I think, is in 2015, 2016, a colleague and I organised a conference in Sydney to see if civil society, as in ordinary humans, wanted to come together and build a new economy network. And so if you ever look up, hang on, can I type in the chat? So I am really proud of this, the neweconomy.org. And we've got a conference coming up from the 5th to the 7th of November. The program's out tomorrow. This housing and this idea of building the future. Yeah, absolutely. AELA is interested in all human activities. So we're not saying control the environment. We're saying, hey, let's build, rebuild, and control ourselves. And obviously that all of human activities fit within that. And so we've been building what is now being framed as the well-being economy. Internationally, the well-being economy is being held up as coming together over the last decade to challenge hypercapitalism, to try to put the economy back in the basket for caring for people and not damaging the environment, et cetera, et cetera. So there's tons of great work going on, and you really should check out NENA. That's the New Economy Network, and the Wellbeing Economy, because that's where all the energy, housing, food systems, cooperatives, community banking, challenging corporates, just so many good things and amazing people. So yeah, have a look at that. Tracy, Gert and Fred, you have also been shaking a tree, bringing us together. Thank you for that. Indeed.
That's very nice. I was just thinking actually on your point about Nina. I've been having a conversation with a researcher in the States who did her PhD on the Black Lives Matter movement and ethical leadership, and she's really interested in social entrepreneurship. And one of the themes we keep coming back to in the conversation is, capitalism is built on this notion of lack, and that you always got to need something. It's extractive. You've got to be taking something. Whereas I think in our conversations, we are imagining a future which is about abundance, like what you're saying about just going and doing it and just trusting that what you need will come. And it's actually because you're actually outside of, you need money to eat and to live, but it shouldn't be the driver of what the decisions. You know what I'm saying?
Absolutely. These ideas go deep. And what we talk about is we need human beings to limit their material consumption, but to expand their non-material activities. That's conversation, love, humor, education, sharing, local exploration, finding a new flower you've never seen before, trippy-trappying around the beach together, or wandering through the desert at night, or watching the stars. Like, all of these things connect: voluntary simplicity, a 3 or 4 day work week, universal basic income, shifting to a thriving society, but redefining what success looks like. And that's why I actually love this well-being framing, because back when we built the New Economy Network in 2016, and this is another reason for great hope, I reckon, there wasn't a common framing to challenge capitalism unless you picked another ism. And this rise and rise, the well-being economy movement, which challenges GDP, which talks about right-sizing our economy, et cetera, it's bubbling up all around the world. We've got hubs now in Uganda, Brazil, it's all through Europe. It's civil society. Everyone is sort of saying, we can't just accumulate. That's what capitalism is. It's about a small number of people accumulating for themselves and treating everyone else like labor. The whole system needs to change. We do need to think of the material world and the living world as having limits. And one of our arguments is It's okay to have boundaries. They keep us safe. You wouldn't want your 2-year-old running around doing whatever it wanted. That's insane. So why does our society run around and do whatever it wants? I often joke that the Western world is like a toddler in its sort of final stages of the scream before a big sleep and then waking up and growing up. So, we need some boundaries. We need some rules. And then, but the rest, gosh, unlimitless. You sit around a campfire and have a yarn. I mean, really, when do you ever run out of conversation? Or maybe that's just me. There's so much.
And what you're saying too, I remember being at Balance Unbalance a few years ago and we were talking about exactly that, the issues around economy and, and someone piped up and said, in economics, there's no feedback loop. In everything in nature, there's a feedback loop, but in economics, it's this continual growth trajectory.
Wow, but we've got the feedback loop now, haven't we? Poor old Mother Earth is on her knees, and she's about to stand up and smack us around the head with climate change. So, absolutely,
and COVID.
You examine, Herman Daly and the folks who worked on the steady state economy and built ecological economics, and upon which people like Raworth are now building donut economics. All of these ideas say neoclassical economics, capitalism, the old way of thinking about the economy, really created by old white men with little graphs of everything going up. Exactly. Herman Daly likened it to studying the stomach of an animal without actually studying what it eats or what it poops out. You're just pretending that this system works this way, and you're not looking at any of the impacts, and let's face it, the old economy refers to the most precious thing in the world as an externality. If that doesn't make your average person insanely angry, I don't know what should. You can do whatever you want, and then you've got to work out how to handle your externalities. Pollution, social injustice. I mean, good grief, who made that shit up? Seriously.
Well, and it's the thing about being disconnected as well, isn't it? That these are, this is not our stuff, That's exactly right. And I don't talk about that enough in Earth jurisprudence. One of the reasons I connected with that material early on was the reminder of the good stuff about being connected, and how separate we've made ourselves in our minds. And it's really lonely. And I remember when I first came across Mary Graham's work, the two key things were the land is the source of the law and you are not alone. And I swear when I read it, I almost cried. The idea that, I am an earthling, I belong here, I'm connected at a molecular level to everything. I mean, that is awesome. Why shouldn't we celebrate that instead of being terrified of, not having enough money to pay the rent because some other bugger's making the money off me? So, yeah. Who made that shit up indeed? Exactly, Aisling. I agree. I've been doing a lot of history at the moment. I've been reading back. I've got a book. I should have put it next to my desk. When it turned up, I actually posted it on Facebook, and I thought people would have a go at me for being a nerd. But I said, be still my nerdy beating heart. I've just got a book called The History of the British Legal System, because I was trying to find the specific legal origins of the patriarchy and environmental extractivism. Anyway, it's so much older than people think. Anyway, there's so many. That sounds so interesting. And actually, tomorrow night's talk will be, you might find of interest, Nola Turner-Jensen. Do you know her work?
No, I don't.
She's a Wiradjuri woman, and she's been working with colonial maps and renaming. It's a toponymy project.
Oh, I can't join or anything tomorrow night, but if you could email me something, I'd love that. In the Green Prince,
record the session.
Yeah, in the Green Prince program, we're freaky about maps. Maps are very revealing about our culture and our worldview, of course.
Yeah, definitely. It's been a theme.
In fact,
one of the themes.
Yeah, Future Dreaming will be hosting a series of webinars next year, and one will be different aspects of Indigenous knowledge, like the astronomers who are those amazing young Indigenous astronomers who are out there, as well as all the folks doing many, many good things. So maybe I'll invite that lady to come and tell us what she's up to as well.
Yeah. Well, I'll definitely be wanting to join that conversation when it comes up again. It was really great cohort had this year. Yeah,
we've had some pretty cool people. Hey, there is amazing work going on out there. We just want to share it all.
Do we have any more questions from the floor? There's been some
Yeah,
great
I'm
comments.
happy to leave and let you guys have a yarn about things without me. I'm just about to fall off my chair. I'm so bloody tired. I've been up since before 5 a.m.
Well, I think we should let you go, Michelle. I mean, thank you so much for your time tonight, and really great talk. And I've written down a heap of things that I'll add to our information list.
Awesome.
And and I'm sure that, you know, we'll have a conversation again in the not too distant future. But I think it's been a really great way of really bringing together some of the themes that we've been wanting to explore and we've been touching on. So, yeah, thank you so much.
No, thank you for the invitation. It's always a privilege to share time with people who want to know about our work and share what they're up to. So thank you, everyone. And I've just put the Earth Laws website in there. If you've ever got any questions or if you want to know anything more about us, pretty much our entire soul is on the website. It might not always be as up to date, but the core elements of our work are there somewhere. So do I just press the red button to leave?